Well, we wrapped up the bike build in part 29, and here in part 30, we're going to talk about safety checks on your motorcycle and what to look for when you buy a used bike. Welcome to Hack a Week. So along the way on this bike build, there were quite a few times when I had parts off the bike, put them back on, and then I had to go for a test ride. Well, each time I did that, there's a certain number of safety checks you should do when you put a bike back together, or for that matter, before you go taking it for a ride. So let's go over a few of those right now. First and foremost, wheels. These are the things that are under you and keep you from scraping the pavement with your face. So they are very important to make sure that they're all secure. If you've had the wheels off and you put them back on, even though you've pretty sure you got everything tight, it's a good idea to always check the pinch bolts down here on the axle to make sure that they're tight, and if you have a nut on the other side, make sure it's tight. Calipers, if you've had those off, double check before you go for a ride. For the first time, make sure you've got all the bolts tightened down and push the bike back and forth a little, squeeze the brake, make sure the brakes work okay. Moving on to the rear wheel, same thing. If you've got shaft drive, you don't have to worry about adjustment back and forth. There's only one way the wheel can go on. Make sure your axle nut's tight. Make sure the pinch bolt over here on the axle shaft is tight. Make sure your brake is adjusted right and that the adjuster cup is secured okay and you've got the proper amount of throw on the brake. Give it a little push, make sure it works. Check your brake lights while you're at it. Make sure that they work, of course, with the key on. The other thing to be aware of is tire pressure. Make sure your tire pressures are okay. Get a little cheapy tire pressure gauge anywhere. The more you spend, the more accurate the gauge is going to be. Check those tire pressures. Check out your valve stem. Make sure it's okay. It should be in good shape, nice clean rubber, no cracks in it at all. Tires. Make sure your tires are in good shape. Tires with weather checks on the side, bad news. You need new tires. So now we move up to the controls. Let's make sure they're all okay. Make sure your brake levers are secured and tight. They don't twist around or anything. Check them to make sure they move freely. Check your fluid periodically. That's a good idea. Make sure your mirrors are adjusted before you go ride. Just take a quick look in them. It's a little easier to adjust them when you're sitting here than it is out on the highway. Of course, you can get them a little more accurate out on the highway. If you've got clip-ons, make sure you've tightened up the pinch bolts here on the forks nice and tight. Make sure they don't move around on you at all. Check your headlight, make sure it's all tight. Fuel, go ahead and check all of your fuel lines. Make sure you've tightened everything up and nothing is left loose to leak or anything like that. If it's liquid cooled, make sure your coolant is up to level. I've got my little overflow bottle here and it shows that it's plenty full. You can also pull the radiator cap to check that out. Make sure it's okay. Oil level, that's another biggie. If you've done anything with the engine, make sure that oil level's okay. If you've changed the oil, double and triple check it. Let it run for a while, let it fill up the oil filter, park it on the center stand or get it upright, let it sit a minute and double check that oil level. Lights, give those a quick check. Make sure your high and low beam work, make sure all your signal lights work. So once you run through all those checks, go take it for a ride. Be careful the first time out, don't get too crazy. Feel the bike, make sure everything's okay. Come back, do another check over, and then you can feel confident that everything's put back together okay. Now if you've got a chain drive bike like Lisa's here, if you've had the back wheel off, make sure you get it centered left to right. There's a couple of adjusting screws usually on the back where you can pull the axle forward and back, make sure it's okay, and get your chain tension proper. Every bike is a little different on the chain tension because of the way that the swing arm works, so double check your user manual, check some forums online, but generally about that much play is good when it's sitting at rest with no load on it. Oh, and as far as tire pressures go, usually there will be a sticker somewhere on the bike that will give you the tire pressure. This bike, for instance, front 25 pounds, rear 29. This bike over here I have set up for about 40 in the rear and about 36 in the front. My BMW over there, that likes to have about 40 in the rear and 38 in the front. What about when you're buying a used bike? What are the things to look for on that? Well, that could be a whole long lecture in itself, but the short version of it is the more mileage that's on the bike, the the more work you're probably going to have to do. Now you might be thinking picking up some really cool old CB whatever CC from the 70s is going to be a lot of fun and you're going to jump right on it and motor down the highway. Chances are you're not going to do that. You're going to have to do some work on that bike. Cheap bike does not always mean it's going to stay cheap. You're probably going to have to put some money into it. Now if someone else has restored it ahead of time, well, that's good, but you still need to do some checks. Take a good hard look at the tires first. Make sure that they don't have a lot of weather checks in them. If they do, you're going to need to replace tires. Another thing that's really important before anything at all is the title. Make sure you've got a free and clear title on the bike. My philosophy is if it doesn't have a title, don't even bother. Don't buy it. It's not worth the headache. There are those things you can do where you can get a title from Vermont, etc. But my advice, no title, no buy. Okay? So, moving on to other things. Check the brakes. Make sure you've got some brakes on the bike. If you don't have brakes, you can't stop. Twist the throttle cable, make sure all that's okay. If it's got cables for the brakes and the speedometer, check those out, make sure they're all right. Look inside the gas tank, pop the gas cap off, look for any signs of rust. If you see rust in there and the bike won't start, you're in for a lot of work. You're probably going to have to clean that tank out. You're going to have to clean the carburetors, pull them, rebuild them, resync them, put them back on, and start all over again. You're looking at a few $100. So all these things add up when you're negotiating for the price, and if you go in armed with what to look for, well, you can maybe work the person down on the price a little bit. Chain wear and sprocket wear is another biggie. Let's take a look at what a good brand new chain and sprocket looks like.
Well, this bike doesn't really have a lot of miles on it, and as you can see, these parts of the sprocket have a nice round shape to them. The teeth are kind of squared off on the end. If you see teeth that are really pointy, and this shape doesn't look rounded anymore but a little bit skewed to one side, you're going to have to replace the sprockets and the chain. It's not a good idea to just replace the sprocket and not replace the chain. If you've got a sprocket that's worn really bad, the chain is worn bad too. Just replace them all at the same time. It's always a good idea to do that. How do you tell if a chain is worn on a bike? That's a tough one because you can only do this with it. A good way to test a chain is if you can pull it off and put load sideways on it. And if it bows a whole lot like that, there's a lot of wear on that chain and it will need to be replaced.
Take a good look at the engine. Look for oil leaks. Get right down there and look underneath. Ask the person when the last time was they changed the oil. Obviously, if the bike hasn't been run for a long time, the oil hasn't been changed either, and you're going to have to do that. Just pull that dipstick out right there, take a good look at it, and you'll get quite the story on what the condition is of the bike's engine inside. If you see a lot of gunk in there, you're going to have to do some flushing out, and you may be looking at a high mileage worn out motor. If you can do a compression test, that's a good one to do. Pull a spark plug, stick a compression gauge on there. If you have a compression gauge, it'll come with instructions how to use it, or you probably already know how to use it. What's a good number? It's hard to tell because it's all about the compression ratio. But if you've got 90 pounds or above, you're probably pretty good to go. Even if you don't do a compression check, pull a spark plug, take a look at it. If it's really, really black and kind of gunky, all fouled out, it's running rich, or it's got a lot of oil fouling, which means that the rings are starting to really wear out on that bike. If it's really, really white looking, it's kind of lean. If it's just a nice medium tan color, you're good to go. That's a proper mixture. If the bike's running okay, take a look at the carburetors, make sure there's not a lot of fuel leaking out of them. If there is, they're probably going to need a rebuild. Check out the fork crown bearings right here. You can do that by applying the front brake and pushing back and forth on the bike. You shouldn't feel any slop like this at all. If you do, those bearings are probably worn out and going to need to be replaced. If the bike's got a lot of miles on it, you can probably plan on replacing the fork crown bearings and the wheel bearings, possibly the swing arm bearings. It's a good idea to check all those out on a high mileage, older motorcycle. Take a look at the rotors if it's got disc brakes. Make sure they don't have a lot of scoring in them. If they do, that means that somebody wore the pads down pretty bad once to the metal. Take a good look at the pads. Make sure that it has some decent pads on them. If you can't see them from this side, you can usually get a look at them down that way, right there. In fact, my pads on this bike are going to need to be replaced pretty soon. If the bike runs and you fire it up, listen for exhaust leaks, mostly right here at the head where there's a gasket between the header pipe and the head. If you hear a little bit of leakage there, you can plan on pulling these and replacing the gasket that's in there. A lot of times on some of the older bikes that are a bit rusty, there's a chance you could break a stud in here. So if you see that on a bike that's for sale, bear that in mind. It's another thing you can work the person down a little on the price with. Seat condition is another obvious thing to check out, and it'll be very noticeable right away. It's either going to be good like this, soft and supple, or it's going to be all cracked up. If it's all cracked up, you can get aftermarket seat covers, or you can do it yourself. But if you go riding it that way and it gets rainy, you're going to be sitting on a sponge. Rear shocks. Check those out. Look right in this area right here for any oil coming out. If that's the case, you're going to have to replace those shocks. If it's a monoshock, same thing. Look for any oil that may be leaking out anywhere where you can see it. Make sure the hose, if it's got a external dampening reservoir, make sure the hose is all good, no cracks in that. Give it a couple bounces up and down. Make sure it actually feels like it's doing its job. Fork seals, check those out. If you see a lot of oil on here after bouncing it up and down a lot, or it just has oil on it, you're going to need to do the fork seals. These are the dust seals. The fork seal is down underneath. Usually this is going to involve pulling the whole fork assembly apart so that you can get that seal out and replace it. Look for pitting on the fork tubes. If you see a lot of rusty pitting, the seals are never going to quite seal right. This bike actually had just a little bit of that going on, but it's way up here and up around here. Doesn't really matter to the function of the fork seals. Walk around the bike. Take a good hard look up close at every part of the bike. Look for missing nuts, bolts, bodywork, side covers, things like that. Anything at all that might be missing from the bike. If it's not there and you plan on having the bike complete, well, you're going to have to replace that. That's another thing you can talk to the person about on the negotiating price. So these are all good things to check on a bike that you're going to buy or that you've just put back together, but there's also a few things you should do every single time you go for a ride. Turn on the key, make sure all your lights work, give it a quick walk around. Check out the high-low beam, make sure the signal lights are okay, give a quick check on the brake light, make sure everything's working. It's better to discover that in the driveway than it is out on the highway where you really need it. I think I've pretty much covered everything I want to in this video. I hope that you find your bike and it satisfies your needs and you don't have to put too much money into it. But if you do and you want to do a custom build, well, you've got this 30-part series to inspire you. And I'd like to thank everybody and all the loyal followers and watchers all along the way. As everybody knows, the YouTube comment thing has changed now. A lot of us aren't too happy about that, but hey, we can live with it. What I do now is just log on to my channel and take a look at the comments and try to respond that way. I don't get emails anymore. If you want to email me, you got a question, go to my website, www.hackaweek.com. You'll find my email address there. Go ahead and shoot me an email with any of your questions you might have. I'll do my best to answer you. And keep the donations rolling in. They're really helping out a lot. They've pretty much paid for that 750 Honda that I bought. I really, really appreciate that because, as I've said before, a lot of my money out of my pocket has gone into these videos, which I don't really mind, but it's just awesome to have you guys help out. So thank you so much for all the people that have donated. Well, that wraps up this build. I'm going to take this entire month off. I hope you all have a great holiday season. Thanks a lot for watching. And until next time, well, we wrapped up the build in part 29, and in part 30, we're going to talk about barking dogs.